Pyramid Head. Some monsters are designed to scare you. Pyramid Head was designed to mean something, and that distinction is what separates Silent Hill 2 from almost everything else in survival horror history. He is the moment the genre stopped asking how to frighten players and started asking why the player deserved to be frightened in the first place. Before Silent Hill 2, the dominant philosophy in horror game enemy design was fairly straightforward. Build something visually threatening, give it aggressive behavior, place it between the player and the exit. The monster's job was obstacle. Its design was costume. The scariest enemy in Resident Evil is terrifying because of what it can do to you physically, not because of what it knows about you personally. That is a completely legitimate approach to horror. It is also a fundamentally different one. Pyramid Head changed the contract. He is not between James Sunderland and the exit because the game needed a recurring threat. He is, and there because James needed him there. The helmet, the executioner iconography, the great knife too heavy to swing efficiently, none of it was chosen for maximum surface horror. It was chosen because it communicates judgment, punishment, the visual language of consequence. And James Sunderland is a man drowning in consequences he has not yet admitted to himself. This is the evolution Pyramid Head represents. The moment monster design became character writing. Every decision about his appearance, his behavior, his unhurried patience in corridors, his tendency to simply stand and be witnessed rather than immediately attack. All of it is psychological portraiture. He is not a creature in James's story. He is a chapter of it, a chapter James is desperately trying to skip. The implication for everything that followed is enormous. Once a horror game demonstrates that an enemy can carry psychological meaning, this specific, this integrated into narrative, this inseparable from the protagonist's inner life, going back to obstacle-based design, feels like a retreat. Pyramid Head did not just raise the bar for Silent Hill. He reframed what the bar was measuring. The great knife drags along the floor and announces him from 3 corridors away. Players learned to dread that sound. What they were actually learning to dread, without quite knowing it, was the sound of a design philosophy arriving. Monster as mirror, horror as self-knowledge. The genre had a new direction, and it was wearing a helmet, and it was not in any particular hurry. The nurses. If Pyramid Head represents the moment monster design became character writing, the nurses represent something equally important and considerably less discussed. The moment Silent Hill proved that the same image could tell 2 completely different stories, depending on who was generating it. That sounds like a small technical achievement. It is actually the foundation of everything that makes the series extraordinary. The nurses appear in Silent Hill 1 and Silent Hill 2. They look similar enough that casual players file them together without a second thought. Same white uniforms, same hospital setting, same unsettling movement. The reasonable assumption is that Konami found a design that worked and reused it, which is how most franchises operate and which is, in this specific case, almost entirely wrong. In SH1, the nurses are Alessa's creation. Medical authority twisted into something predatory by a child who experienced hospitals as sites of suffering rather than healing. In SH2, they are James's creation. Clinical detachment used as a costume for repressed desire that has nowhere healthy to go. Same visual language, completely opposite psychological origin. The design team did not reuse an asset. They demonstrated that Silent Hill's monster generation system was sophisticated enough to produce identical-looking results from entirely different source material. This is the evolution the nurses represent, the establishment of Silent Hill's core design rule, the one that everything else in the series depends on. Monsters are not invented by the town. They are revealed by the people inside it. The town is a machine for reading damage and producing shapes. And different damage produces different shapes that sometimes, by coincidence or by dark irony, look remarkably similar on the outside. The implications of this rule compound across the entire franchise. It means every monster requires a question before it requires a reaction. Not what is that, but whose is that? It means the horror is never free-floating, never environmental in the generic sense, never simply atmosphere. It is always specific, always sourced, always a portrait of something real happening inside someone real. The nurses established that rule in practice, before the series had even articulated it in theory. 2 games, 2 meanings, 1 uniform. Silent Hill had decided that its monsters would never be decorative. It just needed 2 chances with the same costume to prove it. The lying figure. Most horror franchises spend their opening minutes establishing the world. Silent Hill 2 spends its opening minutes establishing the protagonist's psychology, and it does so using a monster most players process as scenery and immediately forget. The lying figure is not scenery. The lying figure is the thesis. And the fact that it reads as scenery is exactly what makes it so quietly devastating as a piece of design. This is the evolution the lying figure represents, the moment Silent Hill learned to front-load its meaning. Earlier survival horror operated on a reveal structure. Context arrives late, explanation arrives later. The full picture assembles over time. Silent Hill 2 puts the answer in the wow first room and trusts the player to not recognize it yet. That trust is not naive, it is architectural. The game is designed to be experienced twice, once in ignorance and once in comprehension. And the second experience is considerably more distressing than the first. The lying figure is James Sunderland before James Sunderland understands himself, collapsed and still moving, wrapped in the coat of someone performing normalcy, convulsing underneath the surface presentation, unable to rise and unable to stop. Every element of the creature's design maps onto James's psychological state with a precision that only becomes visible in retrospect, which means the game planted a complete character study in the tutorial section and wagered that players would walk past it without stopping. That wager reflects something significant about how Silent Hill 2 understood its audience. It assumed players were capable of retrospective horror, the specific dread that arrives not when something frightening happens, but when you realize something frightening was happening the whole time and you missed it. The lying figure is the instrument of that dread. Its job is to mean everything immediately and communicate nothing until later. The evolution here is also about authorial confidence. Designing a monster that carries this much meaning in its first appearance requires believing the audience will eventually circle back and find it. It requires trusting that the horror of recognition is worth more than the horror of the moment. Silent Hill 2 made that bet with its very first enemy, in its very first encounter. And the bet has been paying out for over 2 decades of replays and analyses and players staring at that writhing figure in the opening minutes, wondering why it suddenly feels so much more specific than it used to. The mannequin. By the time the mannequin appears in Silent Hill 2, the game has already established its operating principle. The town reads the protagonist and builds accordingly. The player knows this, at least intellectually. What the mannequin demonstrates is that knowing the principle provides absolutely no protection against its application, which is the most Silent Hill sentence in the history of Silent Hill sentences. The mannequin is the evolution of something specific, the point at which Silent Hill stopped being satisfied with psychological horror that was merely suggestive and started producing horror that was explicitly, uncomfortably diagnostic. Earlier monsters gesture toward their meaning. The mannequin does not gesture. It constructs its meaning out of the protagonist's damage and sends it walking down a corridor at the player without apology or abstraction. 2 lower halves of female mannequins, fused and walking. The fragmentation is not a design flourish. It is the diagnosis. James's relationship to women after years of a marriage that existed in paperwork but not in presence has not been processed or examined or addressed in any direction. It has been suppressed, which in Silent Hill means it has been stored somewhere. The town has full access to. The mannequin is what the town found in storage and decided to assemble and animate and point toward the nearest exit James needed to use. What the mannequin represents in the evolution of the franchise is the moment Silent Hill committed fully to discomfort as a design value. Not the discomfort of being chased or outnumbered or underpowered. Survival horror had that covered. But the discomfort of recognition, of seeing something that reflects something true and unflattering about a character you have been inhabiting and realizing the game designed that reflection deliberately and precisely and is not going to look away first. This approach required the series to make a choice that not every horror franchise is willing to make, to prioritize meaning over palatability. The mannequin is not enjoyable to look at in either sense of the word. It is grotesque on the surface and damning underneath the surface, and neither layer offers any comfort. It is a Monster designed to be correct rather than cool, accurate rather than impressive. Silent Hill decided that accuracy was more frightening than anything else it could build. The mannequin is the proof of concept for that decision, still walking toward you on 4 legs, still refusing to be anything other than exactly what it is. Samael, the incubator. Every evolution has a destination. For Silent Hill 1, the destination is standing at the end of the game, wearing corrupted divinity like a second skin, enormous and inevitable, the product of decades of suffering concentrated into a single theological conclusion. Samael, the god the Order built everything toward, the incubator that housed it during its arrival. The moment Silent Hill 1 revealed that its monsters were never the point. This is the evolution Samael represents, the transition from horror as atmosphere to horror as architecture. The creatures filling SH1's fog, the gray children, the airborne threats, the creatures in the sewers and school and hospital, read initially as the game's primary horror content, frightening things in frightening spaces, standard survival horror inventory. The revelation Samael delivers at the end is that all of it was infrastructure. The monsters were not the destination. They were the construction crew, and the building they were constructing was this. The design leans fully into corrupted religious iconography. Wings that suggest transcendence but carry the texture of suffering, scale that communicates inevitability rather than simply size, a visual language pulled from the imagery of divinity, and run through the specific corruption of a cult that treated a child's pain as a building material. It does not look like a monster in the conventional survival horror sense. It looks like a ceremony reaching its conclusion. The lore underneath makes the architectural metaphor explicit. The Order's plan required Alessa as a vessel, required her suffering as fuel, required the town's transformation into a nightmare space as the environment necessary for gestation. Every horrible thing in Silent Hill 1 was part of a process, a long, meticulously sustained, extraordinarily cruel process aimed at producing something that could have presumably simply appeared if it wanted to, which is a theological efficiency problem the Order never seemed particularly troubled by. But the real significance is what this structure established for the franchise going forward. SH1 demonstrated that a Silent Hill game could operate on 2 levels simultaneously: immediate horror that functions as survival gameplay, and underlying architecture that recontextualizes that horror once the full picture arrives. The monsters scare you now. Samael explains why they existed. That 2-level design, fear first, meaning second, meaning retroactively deepening the fear, became the template. Every subsequent game with ambitions worth discussing was trying to do what SH1 did: build something that makes more sense the second time you understand what you were walking through. Valtiel. There is a moment in Silent Hill 3 where the series quietly expands its own mythology in a way that does not announce itself as an expansion and is more unsettling for it. Valtiel appears in doorways, at the periphery of scenes, turning valves in spaces Heather passes through. It does not chase her, it attends her. And that distinction between a monster that pursues and a presence that simply maintains its position relative to yours represents one of the most significant evolutions in what Silent Hill was willing to include in its horror. Valtiel is the evolution of something the series had not fully explored before, horror that originates outside the protagonist entirely. Pyramid Head, the lying figure, the mannequin, these are internal, generated by the damage inside the person the town is reading. They are the series at its most psychologically intimate, horror as self-knowledge delivered without the patient's consent. Valtiel is categorically different. It does not come from inside Heather. It serves a doctrine that predates her and will continue beyond her and its presence in her. Story is a matter of theological scheduling rather than psychological generation. The rotating head, the white gloves, the posture of something mid-task that is also, at every moment, aware of exactly where you are. The design communicates function rather than malice, which is a genuinely new register for Silent Hill's monster vocabulary. Previous creatures communicated the specific emotional texture of their origin: guilt, repression, suffering, desire. Valtiel communicates obligation. It is there because it is supposed to be there, and the distinction between a monster that wants something from you and a presence that simply requires your continued existence for purposes you do not fully understand is a distinction. Silent Hill 3 understood was worth exploring. The evolution Valtiel represents is the franchise acknowledging that not all horror is personal. Some of it is structural. Some of it operates at a scale that makes the individual protagonist's psychology almost beside this point, not because the protagonist does not matter, but because the forces at work were in motion long before she arrived and will continue long after. She resolves her portion of the story. Valtiel is patient because doctrine does not experience urgency. It is certain because theology does not accommodate doubt. Silent Hill built its reputation on horror that knew you specifically. Valtiel introduced the horror of being known by something that does not care about knowing you, that monitors your position not because you are interesting, but because you are necessary. Being pursued by your own guilt is terrifying. Being attended by something that views you as a scheduled event is something else entirely, and Silent Hill 3 had the confidence to introduce that something else without explaining it completely. Abstract Daddy. Silent Hill 2 is, on its surface, James Sunderland's story, his town, his monsters, his guilt, his reckoning. The game is so thoroughly focused on one man's psychology that it risks becoming claustrophobic, a horror experience so interior that the world outside James's damage barely registers. Abstract Daddy is the moment the game deliberately breaks that focus, and the crack it creates lets in a different kind of horror entirely. Angela Orozco's monster, not James's. Two figures moving beneath a stretched membrane, advancing through the Blue Creek apartments with a slow, rhythmic wrongness that encodes its meaning directly and without abstraction. The town read Angela, without her consent, without her knowledge, without any apparent concern for what the reading would produce, and built this. And then it placed it somewhere James would encounter it. This is the evolution Abstract Daddy represents. The moment Silent Hill demonstrated that its monster generation system had no concept of privacy. The town does not read only the protagonist. It reads everyone inside it and builds accordingly. And the results of those readings are not kept separate. They are placed in shared spaces. James witnesses Angela's monster because the town put Angela's monster where James was going to walk, and the horror of that placement is not incidental. It is the point. The evolution of the franchise's approach to secondary characters runs directly through Abstract Daddy. Before this moment, supporting characters in survival horror existed primarily to deliver information, establish atmosphere, or provide emotional stakes for the protagonist. Angela does all of those things. She also has her own nightmare walking the same corridors as James's nightmares, fully formed, fully specific, fully terrible in ways that have nothing to do with James and everything to do with what was done to her. She is not a supporting character in the traditional sense. She is a protagonist of a horror the game does not have time to fully tell, and Abstract Daddy is the evidence. The implication for how players experience the game is significant. Once Abstract Daddy appears, once the player understands that the town is reading everyone, and the results are visible to whoever happens to be present, every subsequent encounter carries additional weight. Whose damage is this? Where did this come from? Is this James, or is this someone else the town decided to file a report on in the middle of his story? Silent Hill 2 is still James's story. Abstract Daddy just established that other stories were happening in the same building the whole time, and the walls between them were considerably thinner than anyone involved would have preferred. The numb body. Every evolution needs a place to land. 8 monsters into the history of Silent Hill's design philosophy, from Pyramid Head's psychological portraiture to the nurse's dual symbolism to Abstract Daddy's demolished privacy. The question the series kept circling was always the same one. How close can the horror get? The numb body is the answer. Silent Hill 3 arrived at, and it is quieter and more devastating than anything with claws. No arms, no face, no voice. A torso moving across the floor of Heather Mason's nightmare through means that have no right to work in a direction that is always towards something. It does not look like the culmination of a design philosophy. It looks like something unfinished. That is, by this point in the analysis, the most Silent Hill sentence imaginable. The numb body represents the evolution of what Silent Hill was willing to strip away in pursuit of its central horror. Earlier games built their monsters up. More mass, more visual detail, more iconographic weight. Pyramid Head is overwhelming. Samael is enormous. Valtiel is precise and deliberate. The franchise's signature creatures tend toward excess of one kind or another, which makes sense for horror that is trying to communicate the excess of the psychological states that generated them. The numb body removes instead of adds. It takes the concept of a humanoid threat and subtracts until what remains is the minimum necessary to still constitute something moving toward you. No reaching, no grasping, no ability to affect the world in any deliberate direction. Just the persistence, just the forward motion, continuing despite the absence of everything forward motion is supposed to require. The horror is not in the creature's capability. It is in its refusal to acknowledge its own limitations. This is what the franchise learned across 4 games and 8 monsters, that the most effective horror is not the most elaborate horror. The nurses are terrifying because of what they mean, not because of their design complexity. Pyramid Head is devastating because of what he represents, not because of his scale. The numb body carries this principle to its logical conclusion. Strip everything away, leave only the forward motion, and trust that the meaning does the work the anatomy is not there to do. Silent Hill's monsters began as a child's nightmare filling a town with everything fear could imagine. They evolved into a man's guilt, given shape and purpose and patience. They became religious inevitability, corrupted divinity, the private horrors of people who never consented to having their damage put on display. And they arrived here, something with no arms, no face, no voice, still moving, still advancing, still refusing to be stopped by the fact of its own incompleteness. The town never needed elaborate constructions. It needed honesty. And the most honest thing Silent Hill ever built was something limbless and faceless that kept moving anyway, because stopping requires a kind of peace the town has never once offered anyone who walked into it. The therapist stopped building elaborate horrors. The numb body is what remained when everything unnecessary was finally removed. It is still moving. It always will be.